Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's lovely to have you all with us. I'm Karen Wolf, and I'm the director of the JCB, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this third in our series of JCB Reads. This is gonna be a fun kind of series for us where we get to talk with and ask some questions of authors who have used the JCB's collections. And for me, super fun because another chance to read great work. And as you can see, plenty of tabs in my book here, Chloe. Um, so let me go ahead and introduce you all to Chloe. And let me also remind you all, Gianna has put this in the chat, but for those who may not have noticed, this event is being recorded. We love to post these on the website too as a wonderful resource. So we'll do that with Chloe's permission after she's had a chance to check this out at the end of the event. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Chloe Ireton, who is a lecturer in the history of Iberia and the Iberian World and a British Academy at UCL, at University College London, and also a British Academy Wolfson Fellow from 23 to 26. And as I like to say about all of our folks who join us here, the most important thing is that she was a JCB Fellow in Chloe's case in 2016, 17, and we hope she'll be back for some of the fantastic stuff that she's working on now, in addition to this wonderful volume, Slavery and Freedom in Black Thought in the Early Spanish Atlantic, published by Cambridge University Press this very year of 2025. So Chloe, welcome. I know I'm going to hand it over to you to give us a few minutes about the book, and then I've got some questions for you. And then I'm going to invite folks also to share their questions in the Q&A should be down at the bottom of your screen. So first, Chloe.
Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And yeah, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the book. And actually, Gianna's going to help me by moving the slide when I ask. So if I sort of sound very strange and say, please move the slide, it's because I'm talking to Gianna. So I'd just like to thank the JCB Library for the lovely invitation and to Karen for inviting me to come and share my work here. I was a fellow in summer of 2017 and just had such fond memories of amazing discussions, intellectual exchanges, really a lot of formative conversations with other fellows and students and faculty at Brown at that time. So it's wonderful to be back virtually. I'm going to talk about the book very briefly, just to give an idea for those who haven't read it and to offer some sort of thoughts. And as a way of introducing it, I wanted to offer a few contextual comments about ideas of slavery and freedom in the early Atlantic world to hopefully sort of ease into the topic of the book. So in the early modern era, over 12.5 million people were enslaved, dispossessed, and forcibly displaced from sites in West Africa and West Central Africa to European imperial realms, where the meanings of slavery and freedom were codified into distinct rules of law. These laws and traditions often differed from legal cultures about slavery and freedom in enslaved people's places of origin, or the sites where they or their ancestors were first enslaved. Enslaved people who were disembarked in chains in the port towns of the Atlantic world after surviving the horrors of the Middle Passage often learned about the laws that governed slavery and freedom in European imperial realms and their American colonies through their discussions with other enslaved people in West Africa and West Central Africa on slave ships sailing through the treacherous Middle Passage, and during the punishing labor regimes in nascent American slave societies, as well as in Europe. Conversations about slavery and freedom took place in all these sites across the Atlantic world between enslaved people. And these ephemeral conversations between enslaved people about the laws of slavery and freedom constituted an exchange of precious knowledge and legal know-how that shaped Black life and thought in the early Atlantic world. In the Spanish Empire in particular, enslaved people soon learned that their status was governed by Castilian legal codes of slavery and freedom, namely those enshrined in the 13th century legal codes called the Siete Partidas, as well as legal custom. Gianna, if we can go to the next stage, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. My new book, Slavery and Freedom in Black Thought in the Early Spanish Atlantic, is an intellectual history that explores how West Africans and West Central Africans and their descendants reckoned with the violent world of Atlantic slavery that they were forced to inhabit, and traces how they conceptualized two strands of political and legal thought, both freedom and slavery, in the early Spanish Empire. In their daily lives, Black Africans and their descendants grappled with laws and theological discourses that legitimized the enslavement of Black people in the early modern Atlantic world, as well as the varied meanings of freedom across legal jurisdictions. They discussed ideas about slavery and freedom with Black kin, friends, and associates in the sites where they lived, and across vast distances, generating thick spheres of communication in the early modern Atlantic world. Discussions about freedom and its varied meanings move from place to place through diverse exchanges of information, fractured memories, and knowledge between Black communities and kin across the Atlantic Ocean. So the chronological and territorial frames of this study are necessarily wide due to the broad territorial scales of these intellectual exchanges and the diverse methodological approaches that respond to the invisibility of these histories in any particular archive. So the book traces how Black communities and kin exchanged ideas about slavery and freedom across the long 16th century, which is broadly 1520 to 1630, in the Spanish Atlantic world, and in particular sketches the emergence of thick spheres of communication among free and enslaved Black people between key port towns through relays of word of mouth, epistolary networks, and legal powers. And if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. In particular, everyday lives and experiences in the ports that constituted the maritime trading routes of the late 16th century Spanish Atlantic, which was known then as the Carrera de Indias, represented here with the red lines. And these ports were namely Cartagena de Indias, Havana, Nombre de Dios, Sevilla, and Veracruz, as well as the towns dotted along trading routes between key ports and viceregal capitals, especially Lima and Mexico City, were often intertwined with events across the Atlantic as ship passengers and port dwellers trafficked in mundane and noteworthy information about people and events in faraway places. The book explores how relays of word of mouth, stitched together through itinerant merchant communities, mariners, and passengers, bridged vast distances across the Spanish Empire and allowed Black dwellers to send and receive messages from kin and associates from afar. Tapping official and informal messengers also allowed Black people to partake in a lettered world of communication by sending and receiving missives that traveled across the Atlantic. Rare surviving letters penned by enslaved Black people to their distant kin also reveal conversations about their hopes and expectations of freedom. In the book, I argue that the existence of vast spheres of communication and the speed of communication flows across the late 16th century Spanish Atlantic shaped the lives, ideas, and legal consciousness of enslaved and free Black people who lived in key trading entrepots. The intensity and fast pace of maritime communication between key port towns in this period meant that news in Sevilla in Spain about an enslaved person's litigation for freedom against their owner in a royal court, or news of how an owner had sold one of their slaves and displaced them from Sevilla, or news about how an enslaved person's liberation from slavery may well have reached friends and acquaintances in the ports of Veracruz or Cartagena in the Caribbean more quickly than the same news traveled to kin living in other parts of Castilla. For instance, enslaved and free Black residents of late 16th century Sevilla could and did send a letter or message through word of mouth to an associate or kin in the Spanish Caribbean and reasonably expect a response with the arrival of the fleet the following year. So in the next slide, I'm going to show a few details of an extraordinary vista of Sevilla painted by Alonso Coello in the late 16th century that shows the arrival of the annual fleet of ships in the Americas. This is the full painting, and we'll go to the next slide for one of the details. Over here, we can see fleets arriving, but people gathering also at the riverbanks. And the next slide, please. Thank you. And in this particular detail, we can see passengers coming off the fleets onto the river. And to the final slide, please. Thank you very much. Here in the last detail, I've highlighted the depiction of a woman of African descent who approached the shores of the river during the arrival of the fleets, perhaps to talk or trade with passengers who were disembarking from the Indies. This constant movement of people, information, and news about freedom in particular sites served as crucial infrastructure for certain Black individuals and communities to exchange ideas about the laws and customs of slavery and freedom. And partaking in these flows of communication allowed free and enslaved Black people to gather requisite information, knowledge, and strategies to seek or defend their own freedom before royal courts dotted across Spanish imperial realms. And these spheres of communication also shape the legal consciousness and political strategies of Black religious brotherhoods and confraternities on both sides of the Atlantic in this period. For example, the book traces how Black confraternities sometimes maintain contact with Black brotherhoods in other sites and shared legal strategies. One example is the leader of a prominent Black confraternity in late 16th century Lima in Peru named Francisco de Gamarra, who had resided as an enslaved person in Sevilla prior to his time in Lima. Upon his liberation from slavery in Sevilla, he had crossed the Atlantic and settled in Lima, where he became a sought-after builder. In Lima, Gamarra drew on a lifetime of experiences and memories from Sevilla, as well as his ongoing ties to the city in his work in the Brotherhood, especially as his enslaved daughter languished there while he sought to raise funds to pay for the price of her liberty and her voyage to Lima. The following slide shows the earliest known portrait of an Afro-descendant woman in Spain, painted by the artist Diego Velázquez circa 1618 in Sevilla. I personally find this image to be so poignant when thinking about the broader kinship and socioeconomic ties and knowledge that enslaved women in late 16th century Sevilla would have built through their labor and life in the city, like the knowledge and intellectual life of Gamarra's enslaved daughter, Ana, who waited for her father to send funds from Lima for her liberation. And once he did send those funds, Ana later applied for a permit to cross the Atlantic as a free woman to join her father in Lima. And the book also attempts to trace how free and enslaved Black people attempted in their daily lives, to forge a sense of belonging in an empire that was often hostile to them. I explore how free Black political actors often deftly negotiated various and often overlapping legal jurisdictions and deployed political discourses of belonging to broaden the meanings of Black freedom in the Spanish Empire. Next slide, please. The book is therefore an exploration of the rich, complicated, and worldly lives of people of African descent as they negotiated experiences of enslavement and liberation from slavery in the early modern empire. The book crisscrosses multiple scales of analysis from micro to macro, from the formal to the intimate, and from individuals' engagement with institutional processes to their spatial cosmographies. In disparate but intimately tied sites in the early Spanish Empire, from Sevilla to Mexico City to Nombre de Dios to Lima and other key ports and towns, West Africans, West Central Africans, and their descendants not only traveled between such spaces and constructed a Black Iberian world, but actively assembled a dynamic Black public sphere across oceans, seas, and overland trading routes, and offered their own competing intellectual visions of slavery and freedom. And in this Black Iberian world, in the shared Black Iberian Atlantic world, the meanings of slavery and freedom were fiercely contested and claimed. Next slide, please. Throughout 6 chapters, I explore how freedom was regarded as a possession that enslaved, free, and liberated people sought to protect, document, purchase, practice, and define. Free and enslaved people of African descent understood freedom as a legal and juridical condition constituted in law, but that also could be something that was elastic, which they tried to shape through various different means, but that they should certainly strive to protect, since their freedom could be easily stolen or taken away from them. Weaving together thousands of archival fragments, the study recreates the worlds and dilemmas of extraordinary individuals and communities, while mapping the development of early modern Black thought about slavery and freedom. From a free Black mother's embarkation license to cross the Atlantic as a passenger on a ship, or an enslaved civilian woman's letters to her freed husband in New Spain, or an enslaved man's negotiations for credit arrangements with prospective buyers on the auction block in Mexico City, to a Black man's petition to a royal court in an attempt to reclaim his liberty after his illegitimate enslavement. The book traces how Africans and their descendants were important intellectual actors in the early modern Atlantic world who reckoned with ideas about slavery and freedom in their daily lives. And their intellectual labor invites us to reimagine the epistemic worlds of the early modern Atlantic. Through fragments of personal letters, depositions in trials, commercial agreements, and petitions to the crown, the study pieces together the lives of Black men and women, both in metropolitan Spain and the colonies, how people moved from one place to another, and more importantly, how ideas, and information moved and operated in different contexts. Free and enslaved people who moved freely or by force across the Atlantic shared information and legal knowledge with those they met along the way. And so finally, to trace this intellectual history, I deployed various methodological frameworks throughout the study, often inspired by various spatial terms in the history of ideas. Um, and these spatially inspired methodological activities often involved assembling archival fragments from a diverse range of archives to visualize a history of ideas about slavery and freedom that was rarely visible in any single archive. And these methods include the following three approaches that I'll summarize very briefly before summing up. So first, the first of the three methods I want to talk about is a longue durée cultural history of people's interactions with an institutional process. For example, that of liberated Black people's petitions for passenger and embarkation licenses to travel to the Americas at the institution of the House of Trade, in order to explore people's participation in a legal culture of paperwork over a long period of time. The second sort of methodological vantage point that I wanted to discuss is an exploration of how people who remain in one place, especially enslaved people, might be impacted by ideas on the move, ideas and people on the move, moving through the place that they reside. And I do this through an investigation of one enslaved woman's legal know-how about the laws of freedom and her broader legal consciousness through an intensive excavation and speculation of her experiences throughout a 15-minute walk in her neighborhood and thinking about all the people and ideas she interacted with while trapped in captivity. So sort of how ideas and people impact one person who's still. And the third methodological approach I deploy in the book is sort of the complete opposite. It's the tracing of different ideas and political moments in a particular geographical landscape or in parallel landscapes in order to explore potential moments of exchange and fellowship between individuals and communities residing in different sites. So sort of what happens when you put two histories in parallel or connecting up places. And so just as a final remark about the book, Slavery and Freedom in Black Thought offers both a deep exploration of how enslaved and free Black people conceptualized and sought to make meaning of the legal categories of slavery and freedom in the Spanish Empire. But it is also a deep methodological reflection and meditation on how to write a history of ideas and exchanges that are not readily visible in any one archive and that were exchanged over astonishingly large territorial scales. The study hopes to chart tentative new paths and methodological approaches to the study of intellectual history from below and find ways to catalogue the vast intellectual production by people who were dispossessed of their liberty in the age of European empires of the Atlantic world. And so to the final slide, please. And with this final image of the artwork of the front cover of the book that the artist Il Anatsui has so generously lent me for the book cover, I'd just like to thank you all very much for gifting me the time to be here today for this conversation, and Professor Wolf for inviting me to this. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chloe. That was super, super interesting. Yeah, a really rich introduction to the book and a really rich work. I wanted to ask you a little bit to share with us, if you would, the origins of the project. Like, how did you come to this? What was the first thread that you started to pull? I think we all know that major projects have many different points of embarkation, as it were, to borrow one of your phrases. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. I think there are many different origins to this project, but I think the first one was a realization when I was, very early in my studies, probably in undergraduate studies, of this really significant Black presence in Southern Europe that, at the time at least, really wasn't kind of obvious in any sort of public memory of history of the kind of golden age of empire, etc. And so after sort of realizing and thinking with that presence and wanting to kind of explore, sort of write history on it, and etc., I then also became very, very interested in movement and how people were moving between places. And I kept coming across old records or historiography of talking about somebody who was enslaved and they got their freedom, and then they'd move from wherever they were living to this other place in order to work. And then they'd come back. And the reason why we had a record about it is because there was a conflict upon their return. And I remember just thinking, like, this is so different from anything that's written about kind of Black life in 16th century Spain, right? Movement is just not part of it. Free movement, people going places, doing things. And I was also thinking, what's that experience in a world where people racialized as Black are really vulnerable for living in a world that's very hostile to them. Why would you move? What would be the purpose of that? So I kind of was interested in trying to think about how do you actually even go about investigating that history? Like, where are those records of movement between cities, say in Peninsula Spain or even in the Americas? So I was interested in the movement and its implications, especially in terms of the knowledge people take with them. In a way, it's starting off much more interested in people who were either born free or who were liberated from slavery, rather than kind of necessarily being interested in the other forced movement, right, which is obviously the Middle Passage. But I mean, the interests were kind of linked. But I think that was that in that initial, and initially I was very interested in kind of how the movement of veneration of Black saints, how that moved across the Atlantic, sort of thinking about Aaron Rowe's book, is who was moving that knowledge. So that's kind of where that came from. And then eventually, after doing all the work on people's lives and movements in different sites, I then realized, sort of quite late on, way after I finished this PhD, I realized just something that had been hiding in plain sight, which is that the most important knowledge for almost anyone racialized as Black or Afro-descendant in this world, in this moment, was the meanings of slavery and freedom. I just, that kind of was something that just defined, it was a kind of organizing factor in everybody's life, in one way or another. So those are sort of two different origins, but that really came to from rereading sources that I already had and just realizing something that I hadn't seen before.
Well, thank you. Super interesting. And I want to come back to this question about the sources and about the framing here. But I want to ask you a little bit about the contributions to conversations that you wanted to make, or maybe conversations that you wanted to provoke, or conversations that you wanted to see develop. I mean, your point about how you were seeing things that you didn't know from the secondary literature, but then also, like with your reference to Aaron's work, for example, like things you were feeling like you were connecting to. So can you talk a little bit about what kinds of what were your imagined interlocutors? Like, what kind of contributions did you want to make to an aggregating scholarship? And then also, were there pieces that you wanted to contribute to public conversation too about slavery and freedom in the early modern world?
Thank you. Those are great questions. I think there are many contributions the study tried to make, but I think the major one is kind of joining a large chorus by now of scholars trying to redefine what we think of as intellectual thought and who an intellectual can be and what political thought is. And so this study is, in that field, probably quite provocative, right? Because it uses terms like public sphere to talk about the lives and affairs of enslaved and free Black people, people who aren't writing necessarily. And that's really a provocation, right, for us to think through what does intellectual thought mean? How do we categorize the meanings of ideas that we find in archives? And I think I was very interested in this book to think about what's the effect of these, how can we measure the effect of somebody, the way that somebody conceptualizes of slavery or freedom? How can we actually measure their impact on state colonial society or the rule of law? And I try and do that as much as I can. And it's obviously difficult work and there's a lot of jumps, but really I was very concerned in this book about the fact that, you can pick up scholarship on meanings of slavery and freedom in the early modern period, and there'll be no mention whatsoever of anybody who was actually enslaved and what they thought about, it just seemed to me a kind of absolutely crazy that this wasn't, we weren't taking seriously the need to investigate the sort of diverse intellectual traditions about slavery and freedom, debates going on at the time, and the ways that people fought really bravely in many ways to, against either against slavery or to broaden freedom. There's a lot of broadening of freedom, broadening of political belonging going on, shaping of empire from below. So I think that was something that that really kind of propelled this project along in many ways. But obviously the archive for that political thought is so different from a traditional book of political thought. So I think it's provocative in many ways in that sense, and it's trying to sort of to ask us to rethink. I was also very frustrated by the fact we had such rich scholarship on, especially the Black Atlantic in kind of the colonial Latin American context, and that scholarship was not really circulating beyond the field of specialists working in early Americas. So I wanted this book to try and speak outside of that field. And I think one of the ways beyond the intellectual history side that it does it, it's also in kind of an early history of communication in the early modern period. And this is really a kind of detailed history of communication from below, trying to rethink the speed of communication, the effects of communication, how people send messages, move around, talk to each other, keep in touch. And I think a lot of what I kind of uncover through very careful reading of different testimonies and things is something that I personally had not read before. It's not something that I knew necessarily. I imagined it and I'd sort of seen it, but I think it kind of reshaped slightly our understanding of how people from all walks of life and all socioeconomic spectrums like understood the world they lived in, the Atlantic space, and were able to communicate, send stuff places, etc. So I'm kind of hoping that also is a space where there'll be some kind of impact. And then finally, in terms of public history, this book was very firmly a monograph, and really makes no excuses for it, and I'm very proud of it. But I am writing a trade book right now, which picks up on a thread from this book, and really is aimed at a broad general audience called Plotting for Freedom, and it's a dual biography of an enslaved couple who plot for their freedom across the Atlantic. And it's been really fun, but it's also made me realize what a different form of writing it is, because it's been a struggle in a way to sort of get out of writing hard-hitting arguments and trying to write something a lot more readable. But it's also really interesting.
That's great. I mean, yeah, no need to make excuses for a hard-hitting monograph. Like, what else do we build on, right?
Yeah.
Like expert specialist work, always necessary to stand up for the value of it, and gosh, never more so, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's so interesting because obviously I'm not a specialist in this dimension here. But I reading your book, I was thinking about, like, in my kind of historiographical universe, I was imagining this book kind of coming into conversation with work on daily law practice, like around the kind of Atlantic in all kinds of ways, like everything from Michelle McKinley to things I know better in 18th century Virginia, with people kind of comprehending and working the kind of the available levers of law, basically. And then also thinking about exactly what you're talking about, the expanding kind of ideas about intellectual history and how do we, comprehend both the content and the spaces of intellectual history. Like your point about, like, the street is a space of for intellectual history. We don't have to think about intellectual history as happening around the seminar table. And I thought about, for me anyway, I thought instantly about a book that was super formative for me, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's Great Righteous Discontent from 1994, about women in the Black Baptist Church in the late 19th century and early 20th century US, where, like, this argument that, like, the church becomes this space of politics done by Black women. And it was a kind of mind-blowing book at the time. But anyway, so I just wanted to say in an appreciative way that I think people who come from different historiographical kind of orientations will come to your book and see its contributions in different ways. So anyway, this is just a kind of, I guess, comment of appreciation.
Thank you.
Anyway, so I also wanted to ask you about, well, I have a list of questions to ask you, but I'm asking you a different question. But to ask it, can you talk a little, because you mentioned the book that you're working on right now, or one of the books you're working on right now. But can you talk a little bit about the coda, which is so important, these really important two extraordinary letters that you transcribe and then translate, I mean, they're mind-blowing, actually. Can you talk about the coda?
Yes, of course. So the coda, it contains these three things actually, two letters and a map. So the letters are written by an enslaved woman called Felipa de la Cruz, who was alive from around about 1565 until perhaps 1620. That's her kind of lifespan. And I I didn't know she, how to put this, I didn't find her in an archive. I found her husband. So I was reading when I in my search for people who moved places. One of the archival records I was looking at was probate records, because in the Spanish Empire, anybody who died in the Americas who was from Spain, born in Spain, there would be a sort of whole investigation into their records and everything gets sent back. And so I was just looking at kind of people of African descent who had died in the New World, and I came across Anton Segarra, and Anton Segarra had, you know, a number of petty, not very much money, etc., and this whole very complicated file. Within the complicated file were some of his papers that the judge had ordered to be transcribed. In order to discover who he was, because he didn't have a testament. This was the main reason they were trying to discover what was his biography. And so in those papers, there was a certificate of the places he'd had Catholic confession. There was his freedom papers that he had taken with him and had on his person. And there were these 2 letters from his wife. And the judge, by some miracle, said, transcribe them all. And so they transcribed them. So I sort of found this, I don't know, like 2010 or so. And it took me a long time to figure out any of, you know, what these papers were, you know, what was going on. And eventually I realized that he was a formerly enslaved man. That's why he had freedom papers, that he wasn't from Mexico, he was from Spain, or was born in Spain, and that these letters were by his wife, who was enslaved in Sevilla. And so it sort of took a long time to kind of figure this out. And in fact, I didn't even know where she was enslaved. It took me years to figure out that she was in Sevilla, and years to understand who her owner was, and to be able to place her in a particular site in Seville. And so the 2 letters are really extraordinary. I think they must be the first letters that we have written by an enslaved woman. And they just tell him about what's going on and what he's been missing. He had a son while he was away. Various friends got married or died, or, you know, did all sorts of things. She tells them about their owners, about her owners, and what they're up to, and who's been ill and not. And she also, in her second letter, well, in her second letter, she's very angry with him because he hasn't written to her in so long. And she's sort of talking about, you know, I've been waiting for years, and, you know, what are you doing? You don't love me like I love you. And then finally, in the final line, she says to him, you know, brother of mine, don't forget, you know, don't forget that your children and I were in captivity and how much we desire freedom. And to me, I interpret this as the kind of her sort of reminding him that they have a contract, and that when he was liberated from slavery and decided to go to the Americas to work as a servant, that, you know, it was on the basis that he would send money to sort of liberate the family. And so what I do in the chapters or before the coda is I actually, because this is so unusual, I didn't understand, is this unusual, is this common? So I did a lot of research on trying to trace how actually this sending of money, sending of funds across the Atlantic to liberate family members was not necessarily uncommon. There's other records of it, other evidence, but also that the sending and receiving of letters was not that uncommon either. And so I, using witness testimonies, really try and piece together a world where Felipa is not on her own sending these letters, that actually is quite common. People are talking about letters constantly. So yeah, the coda, I put them there because I thought these are really important, and I really hope other, you know, colleagues use them in their classes. But also because, you know, it represents probably 10 years of my intellectual life of figuring out why they were important. And what's amazing also is that in the digitized version, originally, they digitized it badly. And so the second half of the second letter, where she talks about desiring freedom, was broken and you couldn't read it. So it was only about 5 years after discovering them or working with them that I went to the archives and you must let me see the originals, which in the archive of the Indies is very hard once it's been digitized, no one can see the originals. And I finally convinced them, and I remember being in the archive and reading this and thinking, I can't believe this is what she's written. Like I thought I'd misread it. Anyway, we eventually, because we transcribed these as part of a project for a Spanish publication, I eventually got the archive to redo the digitization, so now everybody can read it.
Remarkable, remarkable. Well, it's fantastic at the end of the book, in part because I think for the reader, it like reorients you in the archival necessities. Anyway, Fantastic. So does this count as one of the most surprising things that you came across? I
Yeah,
mean,
I
it's kind
think
of
so.
weird to ask someone who's worked with so much material, like any
Yeah.
scholar, you ask them, what's the most surprising thing? What's your, whatever. And it's impossible. But did this count as like the most surprising thing or one of the most surprising things that you
I
encountered?
think so, because also I encountered it so early in my research. I don't know if already when I was doing my MA, I had this letter probably, it was really early. And it took so long to figure out. And also I was just in the archive writing for the Plotting for Freedom. I'm trying to follow, because there's a whole dispute she has with her owner, and etc. So I was trying to follow what happens after. And I found a record of her signing a notarial uh, how do you call it, escritura, a notarial contract, in a notary that's located in a market where slaves were sold. So I kind of can now place her in this place. But anyway, and so but what's most surprising is that when they ask to sign, it says she doesn't sign because she doesn't know how to write, which is a very common thing, that enslaved people, and in fact anyone, literate people, they're not signing these kind of contracts. But I've spent so many years wondering, does she or does she not write? Did she or did she not write these? Or did she go to an escribiente and pay someone and they just wrote it for her? And now I don't know, did she not know how to write? Did she know how to write but chose not to sign this because in this particular instance she was signing something with her owner? Or so anyway, so I think that perhaps the most surprising bit has been about figuring out whether or not Felipa actually did the writing herself. I think probably not. But that's been very interesting, finding other, you find something like someone's letters, and this is a world where it's so hard to, people's lives are not readily available in archives at all. And I think so for Felipa, I've just, I found the letters, but there's sort of at least like 5 or 6 other documents that I have about her life, in different places, whether it's in the baptism record of her child or the petition she sent to the king, or now the notary thing that she signed. And so I think finding all of these other imprints she's left, very interesting.
Yeah, those partial pieces, amazing. And they're so revelatory when they bring them together. So of course, I was happy to see the first map, or I think it's even the first image in the volume is from the Achilles here at the JCB. I wondered if you could just say anything about the work that you did when you were here. I don't know if that's like, that's a while ago, but and let me also remind folks that you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to add some questions here. I mean, I can keep going, but also I know we would like to entertain any questions that you have as well. So, yeah. So what about the JCB? Let's talk about the
So
JCB.
JCB was amazing. Maps, lots of maps. I spent a lot of time looking at maps at the JCB. That was my, trying to figure out, because when you work on such big sort of geographical frames, understanding not just how do I understand this world now, but how was it thought of at the time, the 16th century, 17th century, etc. So even just thinking about in the book, we redrew a map of 2 trading routes in Mexico from Veracruz to Mexico City, and that draws so many different maps and understandings of of space at that time. But especially also, I spent a lot of time reading theologians in the JCB. It was amazing, thinking about how theologians were thinking about slavery and freedom, and a bit of Inquisition material as well. But it was a real space, I think, for sort of yeah, just reading some of those amazing kind of books and debates about slavery in the 16th century that were so important. And also, I think I just want to shout out, not just for our research, but for teaching, how amazing the digital archive has been, the digital image archive for JCB, because that's been the sort of shift since I was a fellow to now. Just absolutely wonderful gift to us all.
Thank you very much. We're working very hard on Americana if you haven't used it. Americana.jcblibrary.org. So thank you. We appreciate that a lot. So I want to give you a chance to talk about what you are working on now as well. So did you want to elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I'm working on the trade book right now.
Right.
And
You mentioned,
I'm
I
in
noticed in your biography,
the
you're
thick
talking
of
about
it.
multiple things
Yeah.
here, and I hope you're not working on that many things, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, I'm in the thick of that right now. And it's actually just been a lovely way of taking a step back and recovering in a way from this kind of hard-hitting arguments to just thinking much more about how do people who don't actually care about what we do engage with it, and how do we encourage them? And so that's been really interesting and really fun. And so it's essentially a history of Southern European empires, the Atlantic world, and the slave trade through the lives and experiences of Felipe and Anton, and really kind of thick sort of descriptions and thinking through the chronology of their lives, and how they viewed and understood these worlds they were living in. So that's been really fun. That's coming out in 2026 probably. I'm writing it right now. It will be finished by the time I go back to teaching, I hope. But it's been nice to have a bit of a break from the next major research project, in a way, take a bit
Yeah.
of time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I noticed the next project is related to this one because you're talking
Yeah.
again about kind of intellectual frameworks of freedom. I mean, one thing you said in the book that I think you did talk about today, but maybe not with a mallet, I guess, is just the idea of slavery and freedom as these separable concepts or legal categories, that it's not an entwined thing, that these actually are distinct concepts that people are wrestling with. And I notice in the book that you're talking about, or at least the way you describe it in your bio, you really have separated out like freedom. Is that how you're, yeah, how are you attacking that?
Um, Yeah, well, I mean, in the book, certainly. I think, when we went in Slave and Freedom, I think people are often thinking, I mean, freedom in the siete partidas, in the kind of rule of law, is a separate category, right, to slavery, and it's very specific in what the rights and responsibilities are of freedom. So that's kind of follows that in the book. In the next project, which is sort of really early stages, I'm actually going to Mexico next week to sort of do a very early scoping project for it. I'm trying to think more about kind of what are the infrastructures of political knowledge, subaltern political knowledge, that emerged in cities of the early Atlantic, well, not just cities, but kind of thinking much more about like what are the patronage ties and infrastructures that we could sort of build. If we were thinking like of an archaeology or an architecture of subaltern political knowledge in, say, a number of cities, and on a comparative frame or entangled frame, what would that actually look like? And I think one of the things about slavery and freedom and Black Thought, the book, is that it's so fragmentary, and there's definitely elements of suggestions of these kind of infrastructures. I think especially in chapter 4, we see that with, the sort of infrastructures of Black political organizing in confraternities and how people organize for royal petitions and things. But I didn't really have the space or time to kind of go into any further depth about how could we actually write a sort of history of not the ideas per se, but the actual infrastructures that allow ideas to sort of take root and be exchanged and etc. With regards to different forms of political knowledge. And beyond just slavery and freedom, thinking about belonging, thinking about war, thinking about loyalty, etc. But as I say, it's very nascent. And I think that the archives will probably, help shape that in different directions. But I felt like that was where I really could have done more work in this book, and just didn't have the time for the sake of, having to finish the book.
Mm. Yeah, that's so interesting. That's what I thought about immediately when you said these kind of infrastructures, just having, because of this book, the thing about the confraternities and also petitioning, that point that you make about how petitions really bring forth law. I'm not sure if you say it exactly like that, but
Yeah,
essentially that petitions kind of give shape to law, which sort
yeah.
of gives a proactivity to the petitioners here. I wonder how you think about that as a kind of infrastructure of political or legal knowledge, and how do those overlap?
Yeah. Well, also, are petitioners aware of that, right? Because that might be something that
Mm,
historians, that we as historians have sort of determined. But if you're
right.
the
Yeah.
impoverished
Yeah.
petitioner in Mexico City, putting
Yeah.
all of your lifetime
Right.
savings together,
Right.
are you
I'm
aware of this?
creating law, right?
Yeah,
As
I'm not
opposed to
sure.
like I'm doing this specific thing, yeah, for
Yeah.
myself and my family, right?
Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
entirely sure they would see it in that way. But I think certainly the responsiveness, to people's petitions is very clear. Especially petitions that go to Spain by the Council of the Indies, and especially people who travel to Spain. Like that's something that that's really clear. And I think I'm interested in just trying to understand kind of all the organizing that people do in order to get to that point of knowing that that they can petition or how to petition. And one of the things that I found in the Spanish case in Seville was there's this black confraternity that's always held up as this confraternity that kind of was taken to court, to ecclesiastical court by an archbishop who wanted to prohibit them. And people had known that that they'd had quite a sort of spirited defense to it and stuff, but scholars had never really looked in depth at the kind of all the material coming out of there to realize like that this confraternity, these brothers had such an extraordinary knowledge of the kind of competing legal jurisdictions, of where they could take their case and how they could maneuver it through. And not only did they hire like the best procurator in town who knew how to defend these cases, but they also dictated to him exactly what they wanted to, their vision of blackness and of black belonging and how they wanted that to be part of their defense. But in addition to that, they also had this extraordinary patronage tie with a really powerful church that took their case to the Vatican, who presented their case to a papal ambassador in Seville. And so when we look at their, not only were they extremely knowledgeable and knew how to defend themselves, and they were intolerant of the archbishop, who was intolerant of them. That's all going on, but they also had these like pre-existing, very deep patronage ties and kind of infrastructures of knowledge, in a way, of political knowledge. So I'm kind of interested in thinking through more cases like that to try and help us build a more nuanced picture of how this type of, or different types of political knowledge or creative types of political knowledge accrued and developed and exchanged among different communities. So yeah, we'll see where it goes, but that's sort of the initial ideas. But I imagine like this book, it will probably end up being something completely different, because I think that's also, you have to let that happen too.
It sounds good. Sounds so great. So we've got a couple of questions from our colleagues who joined us here. One from Catherine, who asks, it's essentially like, how are these ideas about expanding definitions of political thought and intellectual space, how are these being received, or I think accepted, actually, is her question, in the field of political thought?
Thank you, Catherine. I don't know, I guess, is the answer, because I haven't really had any scathing reviews yet saying, what are you doing? I think informally, just in terms of events I've been to or whatever, quite curious, quite interested. I think there's definitely a sort of desire in that field to broaden and think differently. But I have found in those informal spaces and conversations that there is quite a difference in training and in skill set required for different types of work. So in the same way that I would probably struggle to write, well, I would definitely struggle to write a traditional history of political thought, say, ideas of slavery and freedom in Western political thought, I'd actually, probably lack a lot of the skills and the reading and the kind of fundamentals to write that. In the same way that a scholar trained in that field might, really struggle with going into an archive of social history in the 16th century, reading that kind of paleography, developing methodology, and thinking about a social history archive as, a space of political thought. So I think, in a way, we have such different skills and training required for both types of work. So I think there's what I've definitely felt has been an openness and an interest, but more of a kind of curiosity rather than anybody
right,
going to
objecting or anything, throwing a flag on the field.
I think there's probably been a little bit more sort of and quite rightly, but the sort of provocation of thinking about these spaces as a bustling black public sphere, right? And this kind of language, I think that's probably something that there's been, well, definitely sort of a bit more questions about. And that was the reason for using those terms. It was to get us all to think about, what do these terms mean, right? Who gets access? Who gets to be part of a public sphere? Who doesn't, and why? And so in that sense, it's really hoping to engage in conversations with those types of scholars. But I'm also part of a really vibrant group in London, which is the History of Anti-Colonial Political Thought seminar. And so we're sort of constantly, having really wonderful talkers doing really wonderful things in political thoughts, broadly within sort of anti-colonial political thought from across the world and time periods.
Yeah.
And, so I think there's a lot of different types of scholarship coming out that's trying to rethink and reckon with this field from different angles. That's a great question.
Thank you. So Barbara asks a question about about how to advise students who are trying to work in this field, which is a rich and exciting and generative field right now. So as an advisor, it's an incredibly compelling field, a lot of people doing amazing work. What advice would you give to graduate students starting their research in the archive of slavery and freedom in the Atlantic world, and particularly in the Spanish Atlantic world? How do you create your own path? Is it a matter of finding stories like the De La Cruz letters? What advice would you give to students who are starting off on this?
That's a big question.
No small questions here.
Yeah. I'm trying to think what was my I guess I started with movement. I think that's probably, I was interested in what happens when you don't look at history in a particular site, like let's just say Black Cartagena or Veracruz. What happens when you look at people moving across sites? And so that was my framing. And I'm sure that my advisors were all very concerned that this was very vague and unlikely to lead to anything. So I don't know if I guess like any field, it'd be starting with a question, right? Of, what is the thing that moves you as a scholar? Why are you interested in writing this? And I think mine was movement and ideas. How do we catalog Black thought? What's the significance of Black thought? How does Black thought get shaped by movement across spaces? And obviously, through the course of thinking about that to the book, a huge amount of learning and reading took place. And I was very inspired by works well outside of my field of kind of colonial Latin America or anyone in Spain, even Black Atlantic, just thinking much more broadly. But I do think that any graduate student emerging in the field of kind of slavery, Atlantic slavery, whether in North or South America, has to sort of contend with a really vast array of scholarship and different scholarly traditions. I mean, the kind of work that comes out of Anglo or Franco-Atlantic world or Caribbeans is looking very different and moved by different questions to the Spanish world. And reading across those fields, I think really can be really inspiring to help us define new questions. And so I was trained in both North America, colonial, whatever it is in the US, the colonial North American comps or whatever it was, in addition to the colonial Latin America and West Africa, no, anyone in Europe. And so I think this kind of field is really nurtured by readings across the field and especially also readings on West African and West Central African historiography. So it's not really a very good answer. I'm sorry, Barbara. But I guess having an interesting kind of question, something that actually intrigues the student and about this world's and then kind of promiscuous reading across fields, I think would be my two things.
Well, that's excellent. Promiscuous reading leads right into Gabrielle's question about how you see the stakes of bridging the gap, maybe between the Iberian language spheres and other Atlantic historiographies for the early modern Black Atlantic. Like I mean, you did kind of, you kind of addressed this in your answer to Barbara, but Gabrielle asks how you see the stakes of bridging the gap, or of, I guess, moving back and forth, of trying to be capacious in making a contribution to Black Atlantic studies, whether it is in the Iberian context or the Anglo context or the French context. I think the question is really, what are the stakes of trying to bridge that, of trying to address this kind of vast and complex Atlantic?
That's an amazing question and a very difficult one to answer. So I think I'll give a a vague answer. But I think I was trying to write a book that would be very useful to anybody working on 16th century
Hmm.
Spanish history, but that
Hmm.
also was not just for filling a gap in 16th
Yeah.
century Spanish history. And I think this was trying to make a point in the kind of broader debates about what the meanings of Atlantic slavery are and the Middle Passage, and
Mm.
etc. That we all to different degrees have not paid enough attention to the kind of political thought engendered by this hugely violent world and series of both forced displacements and voluntary displacements that were kind of occurring. Um, and specifically how that thought also then went on to shape kind of empire and rule of law and
Mm.
etc. And so to that extent, I think that, you know, it should be a book, hopefully, that people working in Anglo or French spheres will read and will help them to think about, you know, within my historiographical field or my type of study, am I paying enough attention to this or not? And I also really wanted a book that was entirely from the perspectives of Black actors, and by that I mean sort of people who were the victims of racialization processes in this period and what they knew and understood. So there's no introductory chapter which is a kind of here's a general introduction to the history of the slave trade or the history of ideas about race in the Iberian world. It's completely and
Right.
utterly like and it's a political choice that, right? This is a book about the intellectual thought of people who are in this particular category, and that's
Hmm.
it. And so I in a way I think that it would be really interesting to see how that's read in these sort of adjacent fields. And to show, somebody asked me in another talk recently, said, you know, what's unusual about this is it's a monograph and it came out of the university press, because you would think that 20 years ago, no university press would publish this, right? Because it's like, because of the fact that it's sort of from that perspective, right? Entirely from the
Yeah.
perspective of subaltern actors.
Mm.
Um, and that was the purpose
Yeah.
entirely. So I think um, it'll be interesting to see you know, what the stakes of that are in terms of uh, encouraging others to think about, because obviously in my particular moment in time, I made a decision that slavery and freedom were the most important concepts in the 16th century. But other people might turn up and say, actually, no, it's like really different, right? And it will
Mm.
hopefully lead to a series of studies on thought and
Mm. Mm.
on the
Hmm.
significance of political
Hmm.
thought. And I think help us to, even to something as basic as like freedom papers. I have a whole chapter on the meaning of freedom papers as a mode of documenting and protecting freedom. But we don't really have a sense of how people thought about freedom papers across the Atlantic world. It's not really something
Yeah.
that we've sort of studied very much, even though it seems completely obvious now. So I
Yeah.
think in a way
Yeah.
it's sort of yeah, it's trying to get us to think about that kind of history from below
Hmm.
and see what it looks like in different contexts
Mm.
across time and space.
Thank you. I have one last question for you, which is a quick question, which is I stole this question from another book series that we participate in, and I absolutely love it, which is what are you reading now?
So I saw this question because it was in the list of potential questions in advance. So I'm reading that. It's a bit of a cheating answer because I think I've read sort of a couple of pages of it. But I'm currently reading Amitav Ghosh, Sea of Poppies, which is a fiction book, 2008, from India. I loved another book that he wrote called I think it was The Glass Palace that I read a long time ago. And yeah, in my attempts to read more broadly for my trade book, I've been reading this,
Excellent.
but I am finding it hard to read while writing. I must say, I'm sort of very much using all of my efforts to do that.
Okay.
But yeah, that's what's on my bookshelf, and
Sea of
some things have
Poppies.
been read.
Got
Yeah,
it.
Sea of
I love
Poppies.
it. Okay, great, 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 great. Well, thank you so much, Chloe, and thank
Thank
you to
you.
everyone for joining us. It's been a delight to be in conversation with you, and it was really a terrific experience to get to read this wonderful
Thank you
book.
so
Gianna
much.
has helpfully put in a link there to Cambridge, which of course you can get this book from your local independent bookseller, which is how I got mine. So, okay. Thank you, Chloe. Thank
Brilliant.
you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.